When I first started making ciabatta, which was the first day that I ever baked, and I don't really recommend this for the first day you ever bake because this bread will kick your butt, like it just will. But we did everything ambiently, and ciabatta was such a painful experience for the first 6 months because we were actually making it for a restaurant, and so the standard was everything must be uniform, everything must be consistent. And there's actually nothing about this dough that feels uniform or consistent to begin with. It doesn't want to be what restaurants expect it to be. And so as a new baker, especially when you don't have those hands that are just really comfortable with dough, this one's incredibly challenging to get right. So if I had to do it all over again, I think that there would be a less stressful way of learning how to bake than cutting your teeth on this stuff. But then again, it was really like just being thrown to the wolves and learning how to do one of the harder doughs right off the bat, and getting yelled at a lot by a restaurant. So even though I didn't have that experience working like in a kitchen, starting at the dish pit and working my way up to prep and whatever, I entered into a situation where every day I was getting yelled at for my ciabatta. So I don't know, same difference over a 6-month period, I suppose. And we're just mixing one bin today, so it's really an easy day. The way I know that we're mixing one bin is actually a prediction. We bake pretty far ahead in the sense that it's sourdough, and so it takes a while to get the products to completion. Meanwhile, we have our website continually taking orders. And so what we've done is we've started to try to figure out what our order trends are through the week. And they change week over week. And so we're kind of creating algorithms that help us predict how much to make so that we ultimately can run things on an optimal production schedule. But we also don't overproduce. Overproducing is it's wasteful in more ways than one. On the financial end of that is just literally you've paid for the labor, you've paid for the ingredients, and now you don't have sales to cover that. So it's pure loss when you overproduce. It's not a good thing. It's much better to figure out how to produce only the amount that you can actually sell. We're mixing in the planetary mixer today, and so it's important that the water is cold. It's now far enough in the fall that the tap water, it'll run hot for a moment, but then once I clear the line, the water is fine to use in the planetary. I typically give it a temperature check and just make sure. If it's too warm, then the mixer will actually end up heating up the water too much, and we'll be left with way too warm of a dough. And actually the water coming out this morning is pretty warm, so I'm going to withdraw my previous statement saying it's okay. It's wishful thinking that we're deep enough into fall that I don't have to use ice, but for this mix, I better. If your ambient temperature in your room is comfortable, then you really need to account for how much temperature loss you'll have in your dough once it actually gets out of the mixer, out of the kind of environment of friction and heating up, and gets into a bin where now it's just subject to the ambient temperature. It's 72 in the room. The water temperature is 81. I'm using a planetary mixer that I can expect will heat the dough up about roughly 10 degrees by the time that the mix is done. And that's because we're mixing more in a light fashion. We don't really mix to full development. We finish the development of the gluten by the stretching and folding. And so as a result, 10 degrees is what I can expect in temperature rise in this mixer. I'm starting my water at 81, meaning out of the mixer at this point I would be getting 91. Into the bins, it's going to drop probably 3 or 4 degrees. So now we're at 87, 88. And really I like to cap at 84. So if I cool my water down by about 4 degrees, that will be about right. So I'm gonna go inside the house and grab a little bit of ice. I'm not gonna add this all at once. Whenever I use ice, I dilute it all the way so I can get an accurate temperature reading of the resulting water. So just some stirring will get us there. Once the ice is sufficiently small and you've got it going for a minute, it'll kind of do the rest of the work to dilute. And so that relatively small amount of ice dropped the temperature 7 degrees. That gives you an idea. So in here right now is about 7.5 liters of water. I added, maybe oh, there is a measurement on here. Let's see if I can read it. It looks like I added about a pound or 454 grams of ice, if I'm reading that measurement correctly. And that dropped this 7 degrees. There's something different about ciabatta where it's a really wet dough. And so today I'm gonna go through the way in which we incorporate that extra little bit of water at the end, which you don't want to mix soup right off the bat. Mixing that really wet kind of soupy dough right off the bat is going to make it much harder to get the gluten development that you need to actually create a strong ciabatta. Mixing technique for ciabatta really matters. So basically I'm not going to use all the water in my autolyse, but rather I'm going to reserve out for this batch. It's going to be 760 grams that I'm reserving. So I'm going to start with just a little over 2 liters of water. So there's my initial water. I got to decide which of my smaller mixers to use, and I think we're going to fit into this one. So this will be the first time you guys see me mix on a smaller mixer. And this is because it's the middle of our production week. This is a mix for delivery, and again, the way in which we decided how much to mix this morning was derived by basically a predictive algorithm that tells me how many deliveries I'm going to have left of ciabatta for both Thursday and Friday. Logan mixed these 2 bins last night, so there's 80 ciabatta rolls in these bins. We're going to scale them today and we're going to bake them, and that's going to give us our ciabatta for delivery. For basically, these are going to bake later today, and then they're going to go out first thing in the morning tomorrow, being delivered to people's doorsteps fresh in the morning. The one that I'm making now is for what we predict we'll need for Friday. We just recently started making ciabatta again, and I would like to first sort of clarify or frame the rest of this as we have basically a continuous 40 months of sourdough croissant production under our belts right now. And by continuous 40 months, I mean we now make thousands of those every single week. Our measurement of variables and our testing is robust with that product. And so when I speak about sourdough croissants, I speak with a certain authority that comes with having made tens of thousands, actually probably now hundreds of thousands of sourdough pastry. Ciabatta, while we cut our teeth this way and made it when we were early bakers, we then ran away the other direction from this bread because we had such a traumatic experience. And so I'm coming back at this bread now a little bit more experienced all around, but I'm not claiming that I know everything there is to know about ciabatta, and I hope that this particular video encourages group participation and dialogue about it. I hope to read the comments and see what I can learn from some of you that maybe have a lot more experience on this bread than we do. We believe that part of making real bread in a community sense is to reflect the grains that are being grown locally nearby, and to also provide nutrients in a wholesome manner in the bread that we produce. So when you buy bread at the store, oftentimes it is made of enriched white flour, and the concept of enriched flour is essentially literally the flour. Since it's white, it doesn't have the fats and the proteins that whole wheat does, and a lot of the vitamins and minerals are also stripped away in that steel milling process. So what industrial mills actually do is they supplement your white flour with vitamins and minerals that are supposed to mimic the original vitamins and minerals that were present in the whole wheat. We would rather just give you bread that has those vitamins and minerals in it and never strip them away to begin with. So whenever we make any type of bread, we try to adapt our formulas right away to include whole grain flour. So basically, I am looking to see, we have a new flour blend too. This is a high gluten white flour that we're testing right now. It's an organic flour milled by a regional mill called Central Milling. So the composition of the ciabatta today will be our whole grain blend, which we're going to highlight white Sonora today as that heritage grain. It's a long stem varietal of wheat. The whole grain blend that I use is 30% white Sonora flour and then with a base flour blend. It's a suitable bread flour all on its own, so we know that if we did 100% of it, that it would perform. Ciabatta is not like other breads. It's got to have that like open, custardy crumb that comes from a high hydration. And so we really need to make sure that the base structure of that bread is stronger. So this high gluten varietal of white flour is going to basically supplement for the use of the whole grains, which have a low protein and worse structure. And in that way, we'll balance out the formula so that we still get what we want in the final ciabatta in terms of strength, but we incorporate the flavor of the whole grains and a substantial amount of them so that this bread is significantly more nutritious at the end of the day than its typical white counterpart. So I'm looking at this formula really quick. I'm basically going to use 1,800 grams of my white Sonora blend. And while I'm putting that in, we'll do a brief discussion on how you can use whole grain flour more successfully. And this is all very dependent on what you're trying to achieve from your final product. We had a baker here a few days ago interviewing for a job, and he actually brought a loaf of bread that he made on his own, and it was made of 75% whole wheat, whole grain flour. So that means the flour had not been sifted out of the milling process and included all the bran, all the germ, all the outer layers of the wheat berry, the entire wheat berry in the flour. And for me, that bread was delicious and flavorful, albeit hearty and a little bit denser. It's the type of bread that we all should be eating more of, especially when it's long fermented sourdough. But it's the type of bread that's not all that widely accepted out there right now. And so it's a little less versatile. It's smaller because it's denser. And it's really the type of bread that we would have the hardest time moving at the farmer's market. So the way in which you can tease in whole grain flour into a loaf of bread is actually to have a type 85 flour. So what the mill will do is they will sift out the largest components of the wheat berry, that outer shell, which they actually strip. We learned when we visited the mill recently that they will strip just that outer like micro layer which is some of the densest portion of the wheat berry. And then they'll sift out the largest particles in the final flour, but the resulting stone milled flour still has the bran, still has the germ and the endosperm all present in that flour. And so we look at that flour and say it has 85% of the properties of a wheat berry, as opposed to 55%, which would be white flour. So by using that sifted version, we're ending up with something that's a little bit more refined and as a result lighter in texture and easier to work into all the sort of modern bread recipes that have come up over the last 100 years, which are airy, light, custardy, the things that you all want in the bread that you're eating. So I've got the white Sonora in here, and now we gotta get the rest of the white flour. So I'm going to blend Artisan Baker's Craft. It is a commonly used artisan white flour in the US, also milled by Central Milling, with High Mountain, which is another Central Milling flour that's got a higher protein content and represents that high gluten. So we need 1,800 total grams of the white flour, and I'm going to split this 3 ways. So 2/3 will be the base Artisan Baker's Craft, so 1,200 grams, and then I'll make up the balance 600 grams with this high gluten, basically supplement. And we're still very much with our ciabatta testing to see what the right ratios are for all of these things. We haven't come to a final conclusion yet. Every single day we're running kind of A/B tests and seeing what the results are. So this mixer that I'm using is our only mixer around here that is single phase. And I've said before in previous videos that this is our most worthless mixer when it comes to actual production. You can't make a living with this mixer. You might as well mix by hand where you can make a living. If you go on auction, you don't have a mixer yet, and you're trying to do cottage baking from home, try to avoid the 20 quarts. They're great for mixing fillings or preparing whipped cream or beating eggs, all of which are pretty easy to do by hand, to be honest. Maybe not the whipped cream thing, but there's cheaper ways of making whipped cream than a 20-quart Hobart. Yet this is probably the most common size mixer out there on the market. You can only make you can't even make 20 loaves of bread in this. And so the amount of time that it takes to get your dough going, get it mixed and whatnot, and put it on the table, it rarely is the right fit. This just happens to be a day where we need just a little bit more ciabatta. So, you know, you're getting to see this for the first time, but you've never seen me mix on it before. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is don't spend a lot of money on this mixer when you can spend a similar amount of money and get this mixer, which will actually aid in your production. But powering a mixer like this in a residential garage is not as easy as just plugging it in the wall, whereas this one it is. So how did we get this 3-phase piece of equipment to run residentially? We did it completely legally, completely within our abilities. So use an electrician. There are plenty out there, and you don't want to electrocute yourself in getting mixers up and running. This is not one of those things. Yeah, I'm very much a DIY person. I do a lot of my own work. My dad is super comfortable with electrical, and now I've gained some comfort. When it comes to this, I'm still not at this level, and I can at least lay conduit and run wiring through it. It's a little bit above my pay grade, and so, you know, it didn't cost too much to have an electrician out and set this up. Basically, a phase converter allows you to create that 3 phases of electricity. And so what we do is we turn it on when we start our day, and it powers this motor, which actually is right below the mixer that we're using right now. That motor creates the deficit of power that's needed to run our bigger pieces of equipment here, like this mixer, and our dough sheeter. So it's really useful. The way in which you can get one of those is you have to make sure to get the right size for the amount of power that you need. Phase converters are sold in horsepower, so the motor size scales up the more power you need, and there's a correlation of horsepower to how many amps you need to power your equipment. So it's always important before you buy any equipment to understand how many amps of power it draws. That before you buy a single thing, that should be the first thing you're looking at, even if you have a commercial facility, because you only have so much power, and these things are power hungry. It's a math game, and as a baker, you're already very good at math games, so this shouldn't be a difficult assignment. Make sure to look up how many amps of power each of your equipments need, and when it comes to 3 phases, then you just have to look up what size motor and horsepower you need to provide that amount of amps of power. So we have an appropriate size motor for all of the 3-phase equipment that we run on that phase converter. If we don't have that one turned on, then basically the mixers won't turn on either. So now it's off and I can't turn this guy on at all. It's actually a handy safety feature since we do have kids around the facility. I'm pretty confident that they still are not anywhere near a level where they could stumble in the bakery, know to power on the phase converter, then go to the mixer. Even Amara, who has a cookie business, I have not told her all of those details with intention, because these pieces of equipment are dangerous and you have to be safe around them. So speaking back to ciabatta, we now have our autolyse going. You can take a peek inside. All you need to do with an autolyse is mix to incorporation. You don't see any remnants of flour anymore, but this dough is still very brittle and will break apart. So the autolyse is a passive way of strengthening the dough. You can get into all kinds of technical ways of describing an autolyse, but that's essentially what it boils down to, is a passive way of strengthening the dough. And by doing it now, you're making your mixing easier as you finish. You're creating better strength into the final shaping of your product. And quite literally, a dough that has been autolysed is going to be taller when it bakes in the oven than a dough that hasn't. That's the easiest way to explain it. We can talk about the enzyme release and the flavor building and all of that, but just purely from a baking perspective, why should you autolyse? You'll get stronger bread. 20 minutes is typically a baseline necessity. With ciabatta, I like to push it just a little further to 30 minutes, and I find a little bit better results. Autolyses are typically effective from 20 minutes to 2 hours, and after 2 hours, you start to get diminished returns in terms of length. In fact, if you do want to take your autolyse further than 2 hours, you should consider actually turning it into a premix where you introduce salt as well, and the salt acts as a slowing agent for basically the natural fermentation that occurs when you mix water and flour together. Keep in mind that a sourdough starter is just water and flour that has fermented, and if you do an autolyse and let it go too long, you're going to start actually fermenting your dough, which is not what you really want from an autolyse. It starts to break down your dough as opposed to build it up. We add the sourdough starter later on as a leavening agent, and it has an independent process that shouldn't be mixed with that initial mixing process. So now I'm just going to get the rest of my ingredients ready while we wait. So we have 30 minutes here, and so the way that we're going to utilize this time efficiently, and if I wasn't talking so much, I'd probably be done with all this by now, but basically we're going to get the ingredients ready for the rest of the mix, and then I have Logan's mixes from last night that are waiting for me. I'm going to get them scaled on the table. By the time we get them scaled, we will have done a really nice long autolyse that I really no longer have to pay attention to, because I know it's going to take me at least 20 minutes to scale, if not a little bit longer than that, especially with all the talking that I'm doing. So first, I'm going to get my reserve water going. So this is the water that I'm actually going to introduce in parts for the remainder of my mix. And this is a technique called bassinage. I'm using an extra virgin olive oil for this. I haven't baked enough with olive oils to have any type of an opinion on olive oil, and I know that we have people watching these videos from around the world. I know that there's places in the world where the olive oil and the choice surrounding olive oil is really important. I would love for anybody to weigh in on this. I'll learn as well and learn why I need to use a particular type of olive oil. But right now we're using extra virgin olive oil, and that's enough for my mix. You can see that it's a really small amount. You can think of the olive oil as having a similar function in this dough as butter would have in a different dough, except the benefit of going this route is that it remains a vegan product. And it's also very traditional to use in bread, especially Italian bread, like ciabatta. I'm going to retell my understanding of this bread, and perhaps the history has played the telephone game a little bit, but there's got to be some accuracy to it. I was once told that the way in which ciabatta came about was that basically French baguettes became a little too popular in Italy, and the Italians were really upset about it and came up with ciabatta as a response. I actually don't know what the truth of those statements is, but those of you who are French or Italian, perhaps you could weigh in on this and help us understand why this bread came about. I do think that overall the world is a better place as a result of having ciabatta. There's nothing quite like a sandwich made on a ciabatta roll. As much as I love our artisan sourdough for most things, I do think that ciabatta has a really nice purpose. This is the largest scoop that I could find for salt, which I don't need very much of. So our general method of sourdough starter management is we refresh ambiently in the 80 degree Fahrenheit range, and then we ferment and chill our sourdough starter so as to sort of trap it at peak fermentation for a longer period of time. What this allows us to then do is delay our mixes by really up to a full shift while still having a really fresh starter. We have not always baked this way. In fact, still the vast majority of the 3 years were spent me refreshing Harriet 3 times every day and only using Harriet ambiently. She never ended up in a fridge for any purpose. Whether it was Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I was refreshing Harriet 7 days a week. And that was actually part of the reason why we weren't ready to go commercial, because we didn't understand how to use our tools to create our business without compromise. In fact, had we moved too early, I might have been tempted to switch to baker's yeast, which would have completely violated kind of our core identity of being a sourdough bakery. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure most of you use baker's yeast in your baking, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with baker's yeast. It's just we decided in the beginning that we were going to be a sourdough-only bakery, and we wanted to bring that to the world, bring kind of the historical significance of that to the world, and work within that constraint. We believe in the long fermentation, whether it be a croissant or whether it be an artisan loaf of bread. I'll still eat a yeasted piece of bread, but quite honestly, breads that have been fermented too quickly upset my stomach now that I pretty much eat long fermented breads. So I do think that there's a great reason to be sourdough only. And we would have, when we were refreshing 7 days a week, yeah, imagine that. Imagine having a location that's not your home, and now you've worked a really long week, and you want to take 1 day and have 1 day off, which, you know, if also the government is supposed to tell me that I can't do that to run a business, well, then I don't know. It's already, like, I'm already feeling very invaded by everything that's been happening lately. And I'm just wondering how much further you can take that, where people start to say, oh, well, you should be able to do this, and you should be able to do that, and you should be able to move at this pace. The reality is that building a business like this, an old school, traditional, something that has been going on for ages in humanity, making bread, it's actually really hard to make a living at. So, odd, right? Because we should have thousands of years of history of making a living in bread, but food costs are so low now comparative. Like, people used to spend much more of their paycheck on food. We are living in a market where we have to make a living within reason of today's food costs. We can't charge $100 for a loaf of bread. And the truth is, if you go back in time into, like, you know, pre-Renaissance, and you look at a baker then, they didn't bake this much bread to make their living. Yet it's hard to make 40 loaves of bread by hand a day. It takes all day, actually. And try making a living on the return of 40 loaves when you have to pay for ingredients, pay for utilities, pay for transport. You can't. And that's this whole greater discussion that we're having right now about moving to commercial prematurely, and about how basically, you know, everything matters, even your routines. If I want to have a quality routine, part of what's made this business what it is our sourdough process. So if I have to trade that sourdough process out in order to have some sanity, it's a huge compromise on what it is that we do. So fast forward a few years, and now we've learned that if we can control the temperature in our sourdough starter, then we can keep it fresh for longer, and we can take some more breaks throughout the week. We don't have to literally be chained to Harriet, who for a 2-year period really ruled my whole schedule. You go to a family dinner on a Sunday, well, you have to wonder whether you need to bring your sourdough starter with you or whether you're going to be back home in time to feed it. These are small little complexities that I'm sure city regulators don't consider when they push a business out of their infrastructure. What we're trying to do is show the world that, hey, real bread matters, and rather than us all creating fad diets that give up bread altogether, we can eat bread if it's quality bread. At least most of us can. And those specialized diets can be reserved for people that have true allergies, instead of everybody who is in some way, shape, or form intolerant to unfermented wheat. It's important to look at how we've used this ingredient historically and how humanity has thrived from it, and to not limit ourselves to industrially manufactured bread, which I think we all agree isn't all that great for us. I mean, it doesn't take much to just go online and see everything negative about eating bread, but I don't think that in any other period in human history people would have been talking about bread this way. I think that it would have been more likely that people would have been talking about bread as being a form of gold, as valuable as currency, because of how nutritious it was for us as a species. And so one of the questions I often ask is, well, if that was true then, how is it not still true today? It must be the way in which we make the bread that has somehow changed it. And all you need to do is eat this style bread for a little while to notice the differences, notice how you feel it. I don't have to give you much in terms of words. Just go to your local farmer's market and buy some quality bread. Make sure that it's long fermented sourdough, and start cutting out the commercial wheat products in your life that are unfermented, highly refined, enriched, and notice how you'll start to feel different after you eat each piece of bread. I swear I can eat half a loaf and not feel that sense of bloatedness. I shouldn't eat half a loaf. It's too many calories, but eating this type of bread doesn't make you feel the way that store bread makes you feel if you eat too much of it. Unless you have a true wheat allergy, which is somewhat rare. They are around though, and so I'm not trying to, make an argument against gluten-free. In fact, There are some really interesting things happening around the world with breads derived of gluten-free grasses that were common for different parts of the world that didn't have glutinous grasses like wheat or rye. I really love the book Promise and Fulfillment by Chris Stafferton. He talks about gluten-free sourdough made like the real artisan bread that we're making here. And then another baker to follow is a baker in Europe named Era Bread, A-E-R-A bread. So yeah, that's my segue into gluten. So now what I'm doing is I'm turning over this ciabatta that Logan mixed the night before, and I don't know if you noticed, but I put quite a bit of flour on the work surface below. It's more modern these days to use water on your surfaces as kind of that barrier so that your dough doesn't create a mess. But with ciabatta, water is not really an option for you. This dough is already way too wet, and making it more wet is just not in the cards. So actually you got to flour the surface below and flour the surface of the ciabatta itself in order to be able to handle it through the rest of this process. And actually, on a final ciabatta, the texture of the top coat of flour is part of what makes a ciabatta look like a ciabatta. So don't shy away from the flour unless you really, frankly, want a miserable experience. So what I'm going to do now is basically etch into the table the measurements for this. My ciabatta here are going to be 4.5 inches wide by 4.5 inches wide. We're going to make squares. You can do a lot with your ciabatta. You can make loaves, which are kind of a modification on this that we'll have to look at a different time. When you make rolls, what we're going to basically do is evenly spread this out on the table. It's somewhat technical, and then cut out as even of rolls as we can by hand. There's quite a bit of technique to this, and practice makes perfect. If you think you're going to get this right on the first try, think again. Just immediately prepare for a number of tries before you really get this. So this is a 40 batch of ciabatta. I'm going to have 5 across this way, and then I need 8 across this way. So my length is going to be 4.5 inches by 8. So I need 36 inches of length in order to get the right width on this block of dough. I'm going to up that to closer to 42. I want a buffer in there because this dough will not spread perfectly evenly across the table, and by having slight buffers on either end of my resulting rectangle, I can add a little bit of dough material to make up for or compensate for any valleys that I can't tease out when I roll this out. So I need 36, and then 4.5 times 5 is 22.5. 1/2 of my table is 25 inches. So on that side, I'm basically just going to go as close to the full width of the table as I can. So what I'm going to do now is try to center my tape measure against the block of dough and just draw the boundary lines of length. So that's what I'm working with. And for the sake of efficiency, I'm going to go ahead and do this on this one as well, which is the same size. I like working with multiple blocks of dough at once, and actually I like when we have multiple processes going. You have a passive process in the mixer right now, and you have active processes on the table, and so your time can be utilized in 2 separate ways. Instead of you standing around waiting for your mix, now you're actually doing something of value actively while you allow for that autolyse. And it's actually the layering of your production schedule that allows you to become a good sourdough bakery, because otherwise it just takes too long to wait around for everything. So now we have both of these marked out on the table. And since I have two to work with at once, I'm going to use that same principle. Another force that's constantly fighting us is dough tension, which can change from batch to batch depending on fermentation, stretching and folding, all of those extra variables. Sometimes the dough has too much strength and too much resistance. And when it does, you don't want to fight that resistance. It will actually reflect in your final product. I'm going to find out in just a moment as I feel this dough whether I basically need to switch from block to block and do pauses in order to release tension that's built up while I'm stretching it. So I'm now basically going to proceed to stretch this dough to my boundary. So I need to grip it from underneath and first make sure that it's not sticking. If it's sticking, that's what flour is for. And I'm noticing that there are places in this block that are already wanting to stick. And so I've got to get a little bit more flour in those spots. The other thing that I'm being careful of is as I'm handling this, I don't want to be tucking it under itself and creating folds, because those folds will unfurl later on and you're going to get misshapen, missized ciabatta. And if you work with a restaurant account, you will get yelled at. I speak as though I have experience in this, and it's because I do. So now that I feel like my block is moving and not stuck to the table, and notice that, you know, part of this is having the confidence of getting underneath the dough. Confidence is important. So I'm spreading it, and I'm doing so evenly. What I'm really doing here is I'm managing the tension and trying to make sure that the tension of this entire pillowy rectangle is evenly distributed. And so I'm watching to see how the dough responds, and I'm not trying to push it further than it really wants to at a given moment. So what I noticed was a natural resistance right here. You can see that. And to get to my boundary, I need to push that resistance to where it's more like a rubber band. And when you stretch a rubber band and then cut that rubber band, what happens? It springs back on you. So if I stretch this prematurely, score it, and cut it out, my ciabattas will shrink. This actually also applies to croissants. This applies to the way that we do English muffins. This is one bread teaches you about another bread. So I'm going to leave this alone and move on to this one now, giving that a chance to rest. So again, a tension release. I definitely see that it was sticking here at the end, and I've got to be careful of that. So I'm using my hands and getting underneath the dough, and as I get my hands underneath, I'm first making sure that I'm not tucking that dough underneath itself. I'm making sure that my hand actions aren't going to create consequences in the resulting bread. This edge always has to be out, otherwise you're going to see it. So see, right now, if I just let go, I would have furled up the dough or curled up the dough. So I have to undo that as I'm stretching so that that doesn't happen. This dough is like a pillow on your table. And the goal is to be gentle enough that you're not really disrupting all of these fermentation sites, which will represent the openness and the final structure in your ciabatta. So if you leave these type of blocks alone for a moment, then they release tension and you can push them a little further. So it's only been a minute, but now all of a sudden I can stretch just a little further than I could before. Notice that I haven't grabbed a rolling pin yet. It's not that I won't use a rolling pin to finish this out, but I do think that compared to gentle hands, a rolling pin is a more aggressive approach on this dough that I'm really not trying to disturb. And you might not have the hands yet to do this, in which case, don't be afraid of the rolling pin. So I use the rolling pin more early on than I do today. And I would say that that holds true for a lot of people that have baked here over the years, is the reliance on rolling pins goes down over time. So I'm grabbing a simple straight edge right now. This straight edge dates all the way back before my time. It's a ruler, and we used to use it before somebody smarter than me brought in this this guy, because this is the only one that we can still see the numbers somewhat. Every ruler that we've ever bought, the numbers just like disappear. So what I like about using a straight edge on ciabatta is if I can gently, again without tucking it under itself, straighten out the edges. I'm actually not sure why, but by straightening it up, you get a much clearer view of the evenness of your rectangle. So if you look at it as a view of thickness, now that I have straight edges all around, I can see if there's areas of the rectangle where I have more or less material. So this is actually where I will start to introduce the rolling pin. And what I'm noticing in this block of dough is that I have a little bit more material here than I do here. And so I'm going to try to correct that before we get much further. And I'm just letting the weight of the rolling pin be the only compression. Yes, it's going to disturb some of the bigger bubbles, and I'm okay with the largest of bubbles getting popped. The reason being is because the largest of bubbles leave depressions below them with a lack of overall dough material. And when you get to cutting out those portions of the dough block, you end up with really tiny rolls because it's mostly air. Where, again, the aim, at least the aim that has been drilled into me since the first day that I was baking, is to try to make every ciabatta roll as similar to the last as possible. And yet we're using this process that is not really all that well suited for total uniformity, nor are we working with a dough that seems to want to be uniform. But you can see that if I sort of strategically work on this block of dough for a little while, I can tease out the thickness and get it pretty even. I'm still going to want to spread this a little closer to the actual line of the table. I have 22.5 inches that I need for my 5 ciabatta rolls across. And again, I have 25 inches here. So at this point, I'm probably right on the line. And you definitely want to confirm your measurement as you go. It is right on the line. So if I go right on the line, that means that I have no ability to adjust the sizing of each and every roll in case my rollout was slightly imperfect. And with this bread, you really cannot bank on your rollout being perfect. It's just too wet of a dough. You have too much fermentation happening. There's going to be a little variance. So having that little buffer is actually quite important for this bread. Now I'm a little bit closer to full width, and so let's do one more confirmation. Yeah, so now I'm measuring closer to 24, and I've got that 1.5 inch buffer to work with. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before, just verify this block. And this one is looking awesome. And what I'm just doing here is etching in the measurements. You have to be I really want you guys to understand that this is a guide, not a final measurement. I'm gonna go left to right because I'm going to place these on sheet trays left to right, and I'm gonna leave my whole buffer on the right. So that way I can cut wider than my line whenever I need to make a square. So all I'm doing is drawing the lines, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows across, which is my batch size, and I have almost an entire row. It's like right on the money in the measurement as a buffer. So those are my extra ciabatta. I can either, if I get really lucky, maybe I'm gonna get full rolls here at the end and we'll have a little extra. But if this is at all imperfect as I go along, I'm gonna end up eating into this row through the process. So now I'm gonna go this way, and keep in mind that my buffer here is even smaller. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this is the 5th one. And so here's my buffer line there. So again, as I'm cutting these out, I can adjust my cuts in order to compensate for any lack of material in some of these. Although this does look like a fairly even rollout, I do see that I might do that to some extent. Time will show. This bread is a little bit, this bread really involves a lot of like reading the dough. So as you go along, you'll sort of discover what you need to do with each batch. One thing we are excited about is just having a little bit more bench space. We were thinking about adding another bench to this space, and we might still before our move, because we're really using both sides of the bench all the time now. And sometimes there's a little conflict between bread and pastry where they both want to be on the table at the same time, and we just simply don't have the space for it. In our new space that we have planned, we've definitely increased the total amount of bench space that we have, making sure to even account for overflow when we need it. I'm sure it's still going to be inadequate. It's like when we buy new sheet trays, I always think, oh, this is the last time I ever have to buy sheet trays. We have so many now. And then a few months later, we reach that max point again. And again, this is a mix that we did yesterday, bulk fermented it ambiently, stretched and folded, which we're going to do with today's mix. And then it was put in the fridge and cold fermented overnight. And I'm coming back to it the next day. I made most of the ciabatta I've ever made has been ambient, the straight through, but now we have the fridge as a tool in our bakery, and we have an understanding of how we can pause fermentation and the right moments for each bread to do so. The neat thing is that when the bread is in the fridge, it's still fermenting, albeit at a much slower pace, and so it's flavor is still building. The flavor profile is changing. The dynamics of the dough are still shifting, but everything is happening on a much, much slower timeline. And in this case, the way in which you can build efficiency is by layering all the things that you're working on in a slow timeline. So you're basically stacking product after product in a slow timeline. The challenge is you have to have a lot of refrigeration capacity to pull that off. So one of the most important challenges in your bakery is how much fridge space do you have? If your goal is to not have to basically attend to your dough 24 hours a day in a kind of stressful, hurried fashion, because when you're baking ambiently, it's really the dough that's telling you what to do, and you have very little control over something like time. The dough is ready when it's ready. It's your job to read it and understand it, and if you miss that narrow window, your bread is not great. There are many bakers around the world that swear by baking ambiently, and the ones that have the wherewithal to do it every day, I look up to them and admire them. But I question the sustainability of that model for a business. because even the most fervently passionate people that want to bake ambiently every day, will they still feel that way 5-10 years from now, where they haven't had a day off in 5-10 years because their dough is always moving, including their sourdough starter. So again, does baking ambiently mean now I have to use commercial yeast? Maybe that's the trade-off you decide to make. But the fridge is definitely one of the keys to doing sourdough and doing sourdough well. So this one definitely has this depression here in the middle. It's easier said than done to fix this. There's multiple ways of sort of getting material there. I can kind of inch it over this way and free it as I go. Remember, this dough is kind of always sticking to the base layer, so having good hands that can sort of work this around is important for ciabatta. Getting somewhere that I like a little better. This dough doesn't have too much tension, so I'm not going to be as worried about it contracting on me like a rubber band. It still has enough tension to hold form for ciabatta though, so what I'd like to do is figure out how to get more material here. You can see that there's a very noticeable depression, and that's a little too much for me to work with in adjustment. So I've definitely got to pull material to that area. I really hope that there's some master ciabatta maker out there watching this right now that has something to say that will even that I can learn from, because to this day, like this evening of this is probably one of the more challenging things that we have to work on. I think we're okay at it, but I'm sure that somebody that's made ciabatta every day could school me. So as I'm going, if I notice that there's a mobility issue, then I'd really need to get some flour in that area. When this dough doesn't really move across the surface smoothly, it's that much harder to get it as even as I'd like it to be. So you've got to be patient and not panic when working with this dough. The patience can pay off. And obviously just seeing more instances of this dough will help with your confidence. So I'm essentially now contracting it, evening it out, squaring it with this straight edge, and reassessing how I'm doing. Definitely a little stickier. Okay, I've got some mobility, still have this depression here that I've got to work with, but now I have some material to pull from either side. And so again, I'm just going to try to get some of this material over to the middle. I'm going to do the same with this side. And then start to smooth it out. It's actually okay to have some wrinkly tops in your ciabatta. That's, again, some of sort of the trademark characteristics of it. So I don't mind the wrinkly top so much as I don't like if I have a wrinkly bottom. And that's because flour will get inside that wrinkle, especially if it's a big one. You can see what's going on with the top a little bit better, in my opinion. So now I'm going to stretch out these edges to where I need them. And I'm trying to leave the middle intact. So again, I'm keeping that material that I just sort of teased into the middle. And now with sort of more material in the center of my dough, it's a little easier actually to spread it outward than the other way. We have some space constraints because both croissants and ciabatta on the table, and they both want the full table. Okay, we're in better shape as far as the overall evenness. I can work with it now and compensate during the rest of the process. So I'm gonna aim to sort of finish out my block. I have to stretch it this way. So I'm gonna start with squaring up the edges, getting another assessment of where I'm at, and deciding how I'm going to create this final shape, where I'm gonna pull material from. And that's basically the whole decision making of rolling this out, is where am I pulling material from to get the final result that I want. So I have some here, I don't have as much in the middle, and I have some at the end. So we're gonna pull material basically just from the ends, it looks like on this side, to stretch it out, make sure that it's not curled up on itself. You can see that these two blocks performed differently. And that's one of the natures of ciabatta, is you have to be sort of adaptable to the dough that you have in front of you, which it's so wet and wild in that sense that sometimes it will perform better than others and will require more patience to get right at other moments. So I would say that block was about as smooth could be for me, and then this one had more variance in how the material was spread, and also did not have as easy of characteristics to work with as a dough, in my view. But now if you look at it as a plane, it really does look a lot more even. I'm having a harder time seeing depressions, maybe over here still. Perhaps I can just do a final teasing of some material that way. And this is my buffer side anyway, so that's probably a good place to have a little less material. When we don't have table space, there's always the question of how do we find new table space. These modular racks, carts, actually can be super valuable for that purpose. So I'm basically going to line all the sheet trays that I need on this base one, which we just use as kind of a tabletop in this configuration. I need to get semolina. Semolina is another, so this is basically flour made of durum wheat. You can bake bread with it. It's typically used for pasta though. And it's going to act as a moisture barrier. It's not quite as effective of a moisture barrier as wheat bran is. So you can dust the semolina somewhat liberally. Again, you're working with a really wet dough, and if you undershoot this, the ciabatta will stick to the metal, and there's no telling if you will be able to get it off. And after all the technique that you've now put into getting it all the way to the oven, hopefully really well, the last thing you want is to lose your product because it's stuck to your sheet pans, unless you want to have a really awful morning or evening. So I do 12 ciabatta per tray. I have around 80 that I need. So I need, what, like 8, 7 trays will be fine. I'll probably make 8 just in case there's extra. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Done. So we're gonna get another passive process reactivated in our mix. If you might have forgotten, we actually have a fresh batch of ciabatta that is now in its autolyse stage. And if you look at this dough, now I can actually substantially stretch it before it breaks. And I did this right when I started the autolyse. It was really brittle. Now this development has basically all happened passively. That's basically a window pane there that's passing, and that is what happens when you do a nice autolyse, is you gain that strength before doing the rest of your mix. So my remaining ingredients here are oil, salt, water, and sourdough starter, which is flour and water. Because I'm using oil, I have to be a little bit careful. Oil and water don't mix very well, so what we found is that mixing them both in simultaneously is not the best idea. So I'm going to start with just the oil and the salt. And the rest of this mix is going to take a minute, which is why I'm getting it started. Getting the water in to this mix takes a moment. So I'm basically going to just get this mix going with everything but all of the water, and then start this process called a bassinage, where you are incrementally teasing more and more water into the dough over the remainder of the mix. And the best way of describing why this method works is similar to tension building and release. It seems as though you can hydrate wheat to a certain level. Once the water actually soaks in, the wheat is accepting of more water now. But if you try to give it all at once, it doesn't all end up in the dough, and it's much harder to incorporate. In fact, if I added all of this water, I would have created a soup, and now my autolyse would have been very ineffective. I wouldn't have gotten that resulting strength. So the whole idea is first building strength and then holding that strength as you continue your mix. I'm gonna let this oil incorporate pretty well on first speed. In that time, the salt's also incorporating well, and then I'm gonna add all the sourdough starter, and from there I can start teasing in water. So once we get to the water stage, I'm going to be kind of moving back and forth between scaling yesterday's mix and mixing today's. So based on what I'm seeing and how much oil I see on the surface, this mixer has a timing function, which is nice because I can walk away, and I have really no reason to be here because I know that I can at least mix this for 2.5 minutes with no fear, and it will kick off on its own. So I've got my sheet trays prepared. I'm working left to right, and I'm being cognizant of trying to cut these out as evenly as possible. I'm gonna start on the line because when I'm looking at this dough, I'm seeing mostly even dough. Now I can assess just this strip that I cut. And again, I can see, is my material relatively even throughout? The only place that I see that it starts to narrow and perhaps I lose a little material is the center one. And typically what I've learned with big blocks of ciabatta like this is it's actually the centers in all orientation that contract the most, that you have to be most concerned over. So I will likely add material to the center one and use up a little bit of my buffer. So I'm going to cut this one true. I'm going to cut this one true. I'm cutting this one just over my line, and then I'm basically bumping it back to square. Because I did that, now I've got to cut this one over my line. And now my last one actually just used up my buffer. So you can see I ended up with 5 equal ciabatta. if I had cut everything true, then my center ciabatta would have been undersized and I would have gotten yelled at by a restaurant. So we're gonna just keep going back to that consequence. Your customers, if they are not restaurants, hopefully are not looking at ciabatta in this way, because I think, I guess I think more of a realistic view of ciabatta is that this is a wet and variable dough that is meant to have kind of a free form shape to it. So when we try to make ciabatta into something different than that, one of the ways that industrial bakeries achieve that is by simply changing the formula to something that's far less hydrated and more uniform. You can run stiff doughs through machinery all day long and get stiff blocks as a result, but we're not trying to make dense bricks. We're trying to make pillows that just hug all the ingredients inside and capture basically just the most incredible sandwich you can have. And if you put this ciabatta up against the dense kind of stiff dough ciabattas that you'll see at many restaurants that, you know, have essentially, you know, demanded that in their sort of consistency model. And it's weird because, you know, I can appreciate why restaurants need consistency, but also raw ingredients aren't always so consistent. You know, produce doesn't look the same week over week, yet the way that we've built our businesses, we sort of expect every bit of food item to look the same as the last bit of food. And I don't think bread really naturally wants to behave that way. Just like I don't think fruits and veggies growing in the ground want to behave that way. Now we're getting into row 3 or 4, and my line is here. I don't have to really look much further to see that it's narrower than my next one. So if I'm looking at this more as a measurement, now I'm at 4 inches, whereas this one, I'm still at that 4.5 that I wanted. And so in order to make up for that, I've got to grab material from the next one, which is exactly why I have a buffer at the end. This is only a 40 batch, and so I'm trying to buffer it so that it becomes a 40 batch. So I'm basically going to give myself that 1/2 inch now. And again, there's 5 pretty consistently even ciabatta here. You can't get too far ahead on your cutting because they want to stick to the next ciabatta over. So, you know, one of the first questions that might come to your mind is, why not just cut out the whole block and deal with it all at once? It would be more efficient in some ways, but I'd have to recut it anyway. I'm gonna get these next 3 on the tray, and I'm gonna go back to the mixer really quick. I no longer really am seeing oil, which is what I was hoping for. Now we're gonna get the rest of the sourdough starter in here. It's pre-measured, so I just have to dump the whole thing in. I'm very used to working with a bigger mixer. It's less space in the small one to work in this way. Probably should remove the whole bowl, but I'm not used to moving around the bowl, which is much bigger in the other ones. So, got the starter in there. And again, I'm gonna set it to a 3-minute timer on speed 1 and get it started, and allow this to passively incorporate in the background. The sourdough starter will just become one with the dough over the next 3 minutes. And again, I'm seeing just slight variance in the middle, so I'm gonna cut the first 2 true, and then the middle one a little over to get the 5. You might notice that as I'm picking these up, I'm also dusting them from the bottom. So I'm grabbing them and basically laying them across my fingers and giving them a little shake. So if there's excess flour still underneath them, At this point, I am getting rid of that flour, making sure that there's no caked flour, which, you know, would result in something less favorable. You can see that this whole time the ciabatta is really wanting to stick to me, and the only way to sort of get around that effect is kind of unpeel from the dough. This one I cut a little wider. I'm now in the middle of my block, and so just like I said from all orientations, the contraction in the dough is usually in the center. This is probably my first ciabatta roll that doesn't meet spec, and so it will likely be rejected at the end because it won't be quite large enough. And by rejected, I mean somebody here will consume it for breakfast with honey or something. So it's okay to have one reject so far out of all of these rolls. That's kind of par for the course in this bread. And I think it'll be very small. Can you hear that sort of sloshing around of the water as I added to the mixer? I added it on speed 1. And you don't want to mix really fast when you're adding water at first. What I found is that if I can add it in on speed 1 and then finish it on speed 2, that's the best way to do so. So I'm going to go about a minute and a half on speed 1, let this water incorporate, and then I'll build it up to speed 2. The way in which I know I haven't added too much water at a time is I'm watching the dough hook and making sure the dough hook is still actually doing something. If the dough mixture is so wet that the dough hook's just spinning around in soup, then you added too much water all at once. The good news is that time will be your savior, and so you can walk away and let it incorporate passively, but only add the amount of water that you can get away with so the dough hook still does something functional. You can correct that final shape when you place it down on this sheet tray here, but note that pretty much whatever shape you place down on the sheet tray will be more or less your final shape. So now I have 35. So one more row will get me my 40. I'm going to end up just right, and I'll have a slight amount of material at the very end to play with, but I'm going to end up using all of my buffer up. So this was the right size buffer for this batch size. As your batch size increases, you need to factor in, you know, the buffer proportionally. So I have done full batches, like full length of the table, but I like to divide the table up in half. I find that to be a lot more manageable to work with. So I actually undercut the first two because I saw that they were thick. The middle one was a little thinner, so I overshot it. This one's also thinner, I'm overshooting, and this one's thicker at the end, so I'm undershooting. The last row is actually one of the more difficult rows to get uniform, so you know, be a little bit gracious towards yourself, especially if you're new at this. It's not easy to make these uniform ciabatta. And these are quite big. So I'm doing 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. You might find that that's a little too big for your taste. I really like, I guess, the kind of sandwiches that you can prepare with this, even if you end up having to cut them in half. I like this form factor for working with in the kitchen. So my mixer stopped, I heard it. I'm gonna switch it to speed 2, and I'm gonna give it a few minutes to incorporate, but it looks like this water is actually already pretty well incorporated. When I first jumped up to speed 2, there was a layer of dough that was stuck at the bottom of the bowl, and it wasn't really connected to the rest of the dough. But now this whole block is now gaining strength again. The water is pretty well incorporated, and so that's enough for me now to go back to adding a little bit more water. I'm going to set a timer for a full 4 minutes and just let this sort of gently slosh around. I probably went a little bit too far because I'm getting some splashing. So I probably just lost about no more than 10 grams of water. It's not the end of the world, but probably pushed it a little bit too much because of that. I sacrificed this last ciabatta roll banking on the fact that there was a little bit more material at the end, and when I stretched it out, it actually ended up very uniform. It might end up being a touch smaller, but that was my best play in order to make sure that the other ones were uniform. Ciabatta is definitely a little bit of a game of trade-offs. You got to know when to cut your losses in each row. It's a little bit less precise in terms of being able to verbally explain it, but this is a feel thing where you can see the thickness of your dough and make adjustments incrementally. It just requires also very gentle handling. I remember just kind of the nightmare in the very beginning when you have a bad mix, you have a difficult time folding, you get it on the table, it sticks to you as you're spreading it out, and then it's sticking everywhere when you're trying to cut it out. And if you lose your cool during that whole process, you end up doing more damage to your final product just because your frustration ends up causing you to lose your gentle hands and your gentle handling. In hindsight, so originally the sourdough croissant was probably the hardest thing that we made. Once we got that process down though, it's still easier now to make a sourdough croissant well than it is to make consistent ciabatta. I would argue that the way in which we do this, unless somebody can find a easier way than I'm showing here, is just inherently more skill sensitive. So your dough experience really ends up influencing the final product more, whereas the processes surrounding croissants now are a little bit easier to transfer even to somebody that we're still teaching than these processes are. So I just trained Logan how to make this bread a couple weeks ago, and I'm thrilled that I waited until he had 6 months of mixing and dough development under his belt, because he picked up on it really quickly, and I feel as though it would have been way harder. I remember when he first started, and the sourdough, which is significantly stiffer, felt sticky and wet to him. If that feels sticky, if artisan loaves feel sticky and wet to you right now, you might want to practice those a little longer before you move on to one of these kind of wetter doughs. It's time to build the strength of this one, so I'm going to bring it up to speed 2. The good news in this case, the dough is getting wetter now, which means that the bowl's actually not moving around as much. The more friction in the bowl, the more the whole mixer moves around. But it's still moving a little bit more than I feel comfortable. I certainly don't want to walk away and hear a big crash and find this on the floor. So I'm going to stay here while I feel a little nervous about it, and let this incorporate a little further. And we'll walk back when I add more water. I still have this much more water to add, probably in 2 or 3 parts. We'll see. So I'm going to let it incorporate all the way until that gluten is strong again. I'm watching to see if the dough is pulling away from the sides of the bowls as we're going further. Once that dough is kind of moving cohesively and pulling away from the side, I know that's the time to add more water. Even this mix was right on the borderline, much bigger, and I would have opted for the bigger mixer had I done just one more bin of ciabatta. This is a single bin of ciabatta. We literally never make such a small batch, but that's just what was called for today. I'm going to make it into a slightly more passive process, let this dough relax, incorporate a little better passively. We'll give it a few minutes and come back to it before I add more water. Now this dough's been on the table a little longer, so it will start to stick to that surface. Your flour is only going to protect you for so long. It's progressively incorporating into the dough, and so you might need to use your bench knife to help free up some of these, especially center pieces in this batch. And it can get frustrating to deal with, but your bench knife can be an ally. You can see I'm just unpeeling my hands from from the dough as gently as I possibly can. Ah, nice. I love it when the pieces are not stuck to the table. Makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable. Getting to the edge here. Last 3 rows. This one is particularly thick in material, and so I don't actually have to worry about it so much. But you can see that I don't know, you might be able to tell this from the video footage or not, but I'm not really going by my original guidelines anymore. I'm going by what I believe to be the right size visually. Ooh, is this challenging to deal with that when it's stuck on all sides. Sticking to you, it's sticking to the table, and it's very difficult not to damage those pieces. So I'm correcting the piece once I get it into its kind of like final resting position. These middle ones are probably going to be amongst the ugliest in my whole batch so far. And I have to sort of take that. Probably should have had a little bit more flour material for how long it took me to get here. This is getting to be wet enough that it would really frustrate many bakers, even very experienced bakers. Volume is what matters, not actual sizing. This dough is wet enough and you can work with it well enough that when you overcut or undercut, if you're assessing your volume correctly, you can make it work. So overall, I'm pretty happy with how uniform my 80 rolls have been coming out here. This second batch has been significantly more challenging than the first one. And for all I know, it might have come from a different mix. I don't know. I'll actually try to investigate that because the 2 batches varied, and I know we've been playing with formula, so I'll be interested to know if there was any kind of differences in one to the other and how it was handled. This certainly felt different for me. Final row, I've got extra material here. I'm pretty spot on there, so I'm gonna cut it to that line, then undershoot, under, over. This one will end up getting stretched, shaved a little. And as I mentioned, that final row is in some ways the hardest to get uniform ciabatta. Like this one is just big and thin and doesn't have the volume. So I can try to contract it. It's going to be hard to do so. So be forgiving, especially on your final tray. This can be your crew tray or your personal tray. The bread will be every bit as delicious. It just might not look as perfect. I'm just going to lay this one down. I'm not expecting that one to be one we send off. And that was all the dough scrap. You can of course make these dough scraps into something. Today we're going to opt not to. So these are now ready for final proofing. I am going to wheel them into our 80-degree and 80% humidity room. I feel like this small bowl is doing what it always does to me, showing me how inefficient it is for bread making. I don't have to do as many inclusions of water in this big bowl because of how tall it is, so it doesn't tend to splash about as much. I have to be a little careful in this one. So I'm gonna let this go for a little while, and I'm hoping that I can include the rest of this water on this last go round. This dough is by no means going to be all that strong out of the bowl. It's actually just going to be moderately developed enough that I can somehow get it into a bin comfortably, but it's the worst time to work with it. The dough still needs those stretches and folds to build the remaining strength. Nonetheless, while we're developing this and strengthening it, eventually we're also going to be baking the ciabatta that's in the proofer right now. That ciabatta is going to proof for a couple hours, so we're going to come back to it a little later, and we'll sort of be able to progressively stretch and fold this while checking on that ciabatta, which will be proofing the whole way. I'll be able to kind of show you what to look for in the proofing. Ciabatta, to get that open crumb structure, the length of proof is really important, so we'll work on that together. Now it's been going for a little while. You can see that the water is starting to actually incorporate into the dough. You can see that there's still a glossy layer on top of the dough, so we need to keep it in first speed until that sort of disappears. Once you have no fear that there's stray water in there that's going to splash about, you can consider upping the speed to speed 2 and continuing. And again, I'm just going to brace my mixer because of the amount of content in it, the weight of it, and how the mixer will want to move around. If you tried to add all this water at once, you would not get this result. So this technique is important to do in parts. If you want to get this extra hydration in your dough, you also have to be willing to have the patience to incorporate slowly. Otherwise, you just simply can't. Every dough has its limits. We are pushing the limits of this dough to add hydration. So it's harder to get that last bit of water in than it has been to get all the bits so far. But nonetheless, I've now gotten enough incorporation to be able to bump to speed 2 and try to finish this on speed 2. You can see that once the dough is stretching, it is forming some strength, and that's good news because that points to the fact that once we get it out of this mixing bowl and into a bin, we can create strength through folding. A very slight amount of oil prevents the dough from sticking to the bin and allows you to manipulate more easily. So we just brush that oil in. I'm probably going to let it go its whole 4 minutes right now, as it's going to build its strength progressively. I don't mind if it's a little warm coming out of the bowl because, like I said early on in this whole thing, that it's going to drop in temperature drastically once it leaves the bowl, pretty much like 4 degrees right off the bat, into your first fold. So, and it will continue to get closer and closer to the temperature of the room, which is 74 degrees. I really don't want it to get below 84. I want it to move right along through its fermentation. And so I'm hoping that it's starting significantly hotter than that so that it has room to drop to 84. Now you don't want it at 100. Individual degrees matter here. You don't want to be talking about tens of degrees, but rather give yourself a buffer on the individual degree side. Baking is kind of all about finding those buffers, like we did on the table with the ciabatta. You find those buffers through all your variables, and that's how you build in safety and consistency into your baking results. Yet this mechanical force is also stressing the dough too, so you've got to kind of gauge what's going to get you where you want to be. You're also heating up the dough progressively, so it's not always great to just let the mixer keep running faster and faster and faster and let this stuff, eventually you will get to the point of over mixing, but again, don't worry so much about that concept. People throw that out there to beginners, oh, don't overmix, don't overmix. I find that it's actually pretty hard to overmix. Timer is about to expire. I have a little more strength than I had a minute ago. Still a little brittle. And this is where I'm just going to leave it alone for a few minutes. It's challenging to get that last bit of water fully incorporated and have strong dough. Before I even turn on the mixer, you'll be able to see what time can do. That dough was not passing a window pane test before, and now it is, which means I don't really have to go much further. This is how ciabatta dough is, right? What you're seeing. I'm gonna give it a minute or so on 2 just to see if I can help myself out on the strength. That's 1. You can see that the effect of the dough right now is totally different than the last time that the mixer was spinning. You see that the strands of gluten are longer, and those strands sort of reveal themselves all the way to the edge of the bowl. And this dough is too wet for it to just pull away from the edges of the bowl like a slightly stiffer dough would. So instead you're looking to see if the strands kind of run the length from the dough hook to the edge of the bowl, as the dough hook is the furthest away from that point of reference. And you can just see that this dough is very strong. You got to be careful because it's in these latter stages of mixing that you can mix to the point that the dough starts to actually break apart as opposed to strengthen. And we don't even want it to get to the peak level of strengthening. We want to finish it out in the bowl. Because of where this dough is, I'm not going to really push it much further than this. I'm going to cut it here, drop my bowl, drop the hook. This is a really wet dough. It's hard to scale in bigger sizes. It's nice that this size bowl is still comfortable for me to hold, and I'm only going into one bin. I don't have to measure anything, because cutting this into pieces when it's so wet is not my favorite part. But yeah, we typically do it. This is a smaller mix for sure. So this dough is not fully developed yet. It's going to require stretches and folds to get it to completion. Now I've got that put away every 30 minutes now from 11. So it's 11 o'clock right now, and we're going to fold at 11:30. We'll fold again at noon. We'll fold again at 12:30. And then right around 1:30, based on where the dough is in the bin, I'm going to put it in the fridge, and it will then be scaled by Logan, who we're kind of trading. So he's finishing my mix, I was finishing his mix. Around that same time, the ones that we've had proofing now for about 30-40 minutes, they will be ready to bake. So we're going to be basically finishing up the folds on this guy and baking Logan's from last night around the same interval. So again, I'm just trying to have basically more than one thing to do at a time, and that's one of the methods in which you can layer your schedule efficiently in the bakery. Meanwhile, over here, we have now had 30 minutes since this mix ended up in the bin, so it's time to get the first of 3 folds. This is going to be the ugliest fold on ciabatta in the sense that the dough is going to be the least strong at this level, so it's also harder than other folds. But I'm going to try to give it a good stretch with each fold, and then just simply let it fall on itself. So I've done both sides of the bin. Now I'm going to go sideways. And you can read a bunch of other bakers' thoughts on this, but folding is one of those things where it'd be misleading for me to say, do 4 folds, do them in this order every time. You have to see the dough, and remember, you're trying to strengthen and create tension in your dough. So you have to be watching to see that tension right in front of you. There's no real way to know whether there's 4 or 5 folds necessary or 1 or 2. It's a matter of kind of pushing the strength of your dough to the edge without breaking the integrity of it. So I've actually folded this a fair amount now, and I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm going to now let it rest and strengthen, and we will come back to it in 30 minutes. Now we are looking at the ciabatta that Logan mixed last night, that we scaled together on the table, and that we cut and put onto the sheet trays. If you recall, I put it in this proofer. It's been over an hour now that it's been in here. I can see that it's gotten substantially taller since I put it in here, but now I like to add a touch test into my assessment. The dough is springing back pretty strongly right now, and I am trying to proof it to the point that it's not giving me such strong feedback. In other words, it's springing back a little bit slowly. It is when I know that I'll be at a good level. I'm also noticing that it's drying out a little bit, so I would like to make sure that my humidifiers are full, and they are not. So we'll take this opportunity to refill it. If you end up using a humidifier to introduce humidity in your spaces, it's important to use filtered water. Reverse osmosis is probably the best, because otherwise all the extra minerals and things that are in the water that comes out of the tap will gunk up your humidifier, and you'll be buying one all the time. Whereas we've been able to keep these for a long time now, and they're still working really well for us. So the humidifier is actually attached to the same devices that our heat sources are. So this room has some space heaters, just like personal space heaters. They look like this. You can buy them on Amazon. They don't engage unless this trigger is engaged on the bottom. So currently I'm not using all four, I don't need them, but they are now hooked. They're plugged into this PID controller that you can also buy on Amazon. And the purpose of a PID controller is you set the temperature that you'd like, and basically when the actual temperature is below that, it acts as a switch that allows the heater to work. So the heater's now on and blowing, and as soon as the temperature is reported at your desired temperature, then the heater kicks off. So basically this controller, which is very easy to buy, you can use it for humidity if you have one configured for measuring relative humidity, or you can use it for heat if you have one that's configured to measure temperature. And these things will keep your spaces at the adequate temperature. You can do this on a small scale inside a speed rack, which is where we started, but you can also graduate to a full insulated room and get the same result. So we're able to not cover these because we have enough humidity to keep them from developing skins. I noticed that there was too much of a skin on this, is how I caught that we didn't have humidity in this room. So it's not too bad yet, and it will sort of resolve itself. Only the top row was actually even impacted by that. The other ones don't seem to have been impacted at all. So now we're one fold in on the ciabatta of 3. Meanwhile, we are about halfway through the proofing process at this point. So I'll be turning on my oven to preheat it in roughly an hour, where I think that this proofing is going to go another hour and a half in addition to the slightly over an hour that it's already gone. Meanwhile, right around the time that I turn on the oven, I'll be finishing up the last fold and starting to think about moving that bin into the fridge so that it can be scaled later on. And then you'll see the whole full cycle of ciabatta, also start to finish, but broken up into a different workflow that's more akin to the way in which we work in the bakery regularly to account for multiple shifts. We're going to jump back in the proofer. It's been about 45 minutes since we were in here last. Last time we were in here, I introduced more humidity because I noticed my humidifier was empty, and it worked out really nicely. I'm noticing that this one layer that had developed a little bit of a skin, that skin is really not there anymore. I caught it in time. The other ones are still perfect. This one still is a little bit dry. You can kind of hear that versus this, but not too much. So again, I'm looking at the feedback, and it's still relatively strong, but notice how that didn't come up all the way. So you can still see the indentation there, and that's where I can start to get an idea. See how that slowly came back and didn't quite make it all the way. So this dough is now getting to that like perfect level of final proof. You really want to push it till you start seeing that type of a feedback response where a depression doesn't quite make it all the way back, or rather it's like making it very slowly back. So this is a little bit further on the final proof than in other situations. I like to start ciabatta really hot, so I'm preheating the oven to 500 degrees. The thing about this style oven is that the moment that I open the door, it's like 50 degrees is gone. So I actually want to bake at 450, which is why I'm setting it to 500, so that when I open the oven and roll it in and close it, now I'm actually already where I want to start, 450. So that's what we're doing there. Sorry, I'm noticing a gasket on this oven. Whenever I pass by, it's important to check your equipment and see how it's doing. This little gasket is peeling away. It doesn't appear to be a major issue. It looks like I can just add a little bit of adhesive here and get it back into place. But my guess is that I'll just need to replace this one piece here. So as I've owned this oven for a few years, I've learned kind of the components of it that I need to have on hand. The gasket has not been one, but I like to have a couple spare stones on hand, which actually I have hanging out on top. If any of the stones crack, I have one that I can pop right in. I also keep spare solenoid valves, which are basically the electronic valves for the steam injectors. When you turn on the steam injection, that valve opens through an electronic switch. Those can gunk up with anything in your hard water, even though you have filters. And the solenoid valve will basically stop functioning. It's an easy repair in an oven like this. One of the benefits in this ABS model is that the side panel just pops right off, and here I am in the innards of the whole water system on the oven. On the other side, I can get into all the electronics, and so most of the components of the oven are actually things that I can buy at a local hardware store, or at worst, like an electrical supply store like Grainger. It's one of the reasons why we went with ABS. It's an American company. They offer slightly less expensive deck ovens than kind of their competitors like Polene. But for us, being that we are in the US, it's easier for us to get parts for that. You guys missed one fold, the second fold of 3. I jumped in here during the break and performed that fold. We're now on the last fold, 3 of 3. So I've already built in a decent amount of strength into this dough, and I'm trying to get all the way there now. It has a lot more resistance. If you saw the last bit of folding that we did, I could stretch it much higher, and that was just because there was more resistance in this due to the strength that's been building over time. I can't really stretch it very far at all that one way, and so that's a good indicator. Even though we're between folds and it's had a chance to rest, it's a good indicator that we're kind of getting to the end with this bin. So I'm going to just make sure that the bin at this point is as clean as I can make it, and we're saying goodbye to that for now. I have to now trust my teammate to finish it up and get it done right. So it's important to have good communication when you're splitting shifts like this and work. In dough, there's so much variance, so make sure that if you're working with teammates, you're defining things the same way, so that when you're texting back and forth or communicating information back and forth, if you write and classify something one way, make sure that you're both interpreting it the same. So in this case, there's really nothing abnormal about that, but if there was anything abnormal to communicate to Logan that I couldn't communicate through a label, I would have been texting him right now to supplement, knowing that he has to finish my work. He didn't get a chance to see the bulk fermentation. He didn't get a chance to feel the dough. And once it's been chilled, it will change a little in its property. So I'm a big believer that over communication is certainly better than under. And we have learned this lesson the hard way, because we've been doing this type of split shift work the whole time. So you can imagine we've had many situations in the past where something was fumbled on the communication side, which resulted in disappointment for finishing the processes. A huge benefit to walk-in coolers is that everything's on wheels. Okay, so we're loading the rack oven, closing it up. I'm going to apply 8 seconds of steam and set the timer for 15 minutes. We'll start that up, and now I'm going to drop my actual thermostat to 450 degrees. I wasn't very far off. It looks like right now the steam is bringing down the temperature, and the oven's actually all the way down to 425. So you can see that I could have probably even set the temperature a little bit higher. Now it's going to slowly trickle up. This is a gas convection oven though, so it heats up super rapidly in just a couple minutes, whereas the deck oven takes a little longer to heat up initially. So we're gonna let these go. I wish that this glass was as transparent as it could be if I had just cleaned it right before this bake, because in about the 2 or 3 minute period of this bake, the way that it looks, you can just see like bubbles creating on the surface of all these ciabatta rolls and expanding. You can really see the expansion of this bread as it happens. It's a lot of fun to watch bake. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to see through that glass. Okay, so I have 6 minutes to go. I can kind of look and see at the performance of this bread so far. Everything's getting really nice height. I'm not seeing anything that's concerning in terms of height. Sometimes if your dough's not great, you can kind of get a spike effect in the middle, like a mountain in the middle, and that's usually a really big air bubble, which is not a good sign. I'm not really seeing evidence of that, but I am seeing good height, like great expansion in the actual rolls. It's about 5 minutes before we have to remove the steam from here, so we still have some time on these. Okay, so now the timer just went off on these. They're starting to get just a slight amount of color on the tops, which is usually the right timing for releasing steam in many breads, where right as they're getting color, even with the steam, is when I like to release it. I'm gonna set this timer only for 5 minutes and make sure no steam injects. I also have an open vent. It's most likely going to be a few minutes longer than that to gain to completion. Ciabatta is meant to have a crust. It's also meant to be golden brown. The sort of industrial food system has started making lighter and lighter and softer ciabatta, getting further and further away from what it actually is supposed to be, and that's like a crispy eggshell crust with a custardy inside. I don't know why, but we just have an obsession with removing crusts. It's like ingrained in us since we were kids. I certainly didn't subscribe to that channel, but a lot of people have, and it's really influenced the way in which we produce bread. In fact, it influences the way in which restaurants even expect bread to come. When we were making ciabatta for restaurants, they literally wanted it to arrive white. And for me, that was almost incomplete, just no texture. It's interesting, but they had to deal with their complaining customers when the complaining customers got crusty bread. So go figure. This is why community bakeries have such a vital role. Is you go out to a market, you buy bread from a bakery like this, and you get to know all the different varieties. We can make you a soft sandwich loaf where you don't notice the crust, but we can also make you all the variations all the way to a crusty artisan loaf. They all have their own purposes. They are all designed for a reason. And ciabatta is really not designed to have, a soft, spongy crust. It's meant to have a little bit of texture there. So now that there's no steam in the chamber, I'm starting to see more color with each passing minute. It's only been about a minute since I set that timer for 5. And there's already been a lot more color introduced to the loaves. Right now, or to the rolls, I should say. Right now, color is my main guide, so there's no question by the time that these ciabatta get pulled from the oven that they will be fully baked on the inside. When I first started baking, I would take a thermometer and stick it in my loaf to measure to make sure that I reached a certain level. For us now, you do that like 1,000 times in a row and you're always way over the final baking temp, and you realize that You don't need to measure that anymore. If you still are measuring, that's completely fine. We did it for a long time, and it gives you a peace of mind. Yes, it's done. But the truth is, the more you bake, the more you absolutely know by just the feel and look of the bread that it's fully baked or not. And you don't really need the thermometer to tell you. You can also do like thump tests and other things that people do. So I got a timer going off right now. And again, this is now a judgment of color. So I'm gonna cut my timer. And when I open this, I always stand to the side of the door because it releases a lot of heat. And for me, these are just a little bit on the light side. If you take a look at them, they are a nice golden brown. I want just a touch more color on the tops that are still a little inconsistent with white patches. So it's not a whole lot longer, but we're gonna add probably another 3 minutes, especially to account for the temperature loss that we just experienced. Normally, I won't open the door like that, but I'm doing it for you guys. I just wanted you to see. So we'll make do. So when I first started baking, we baked ciabatta in the first day that we made bread, and it was baked on an old pizza oven. We made it ambiently together, Jared and I, starting at 3 in the morning, ending like at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. And you know, when you show up for your first baking day really, really early in the morning, it's a big deal. I remember just thinking about it back then, like, oh, I wake up at such and such time. Now it's just waking up early is just now a very normal thing. It just doesn't feel like a big deal anymore. So the idea of waking up early and making some ciabatta at 3 in the morning does not seem difficult at all anymore. I feel more taxed by dealing with all the politics of our current situation and dealing with all the, baking bread is the fun part now. But, showing up for the first day, the first bread that I ate as a baker on duty was warm ciabatta, very, very fresh out of the oven, cut in half with some honey. And I recommend it if you eat honey and if you like bread. If you can pull your own ciabatta basically straight from the oven 20 minutes later while it's still warm and have it with honey, it's a really nice way to conclude a baking shift. So now we're getting very close to the end here. I am going to let it run the course of the next 2 minutes, and we'll go ahead and pull it right on time. So now I've cut that timer, standing back, and this ciabatta is perfect. It's in that kind of acceptable medium between what everybody will pretty much be okay with in terms of color and not too dark. I found that for smaller items like rolls in our area, for like the way in which people consume bread, this is a very acceptable color that I still am satisfied with the crust on. And my customers all tend to be happy. We really ought to come back to these when they cool down just enough to cut open so that we can see the inside of one of these guys. Ciabatta is nerve-wracking still for me. I have a tumultuous history with this bread, and we've taken a long break from it. It's only been a couple weeks now that we've been working with it. In the last couple weeks, on some of the batches that I've done start to finish on my own, I've gotten the exact results I need, although still with some inconsistencies. And as I've passed on the whole process to the team who's just learning how to deal with this wet dough, we are still working together as a team to find consistency. On the table, you saw that one batch was somewhat easy to work with, and the other one was giving me a lot of trouble. As I look at these, they have the right shape and the right size, and I know they're going to be incredible bread. I would be really happy to have a sandwich on them. I'm less confident about whether that crumb structure is going to be exactly where I want it yet, and we'll see. If it's not, now everybody has seen sort of the start to finish that we're working on with this process, and I would love feedback on whether it's flour formulation, whether you saw anything, those of you who make ciabatta all the time that we could work on. I'm looking for larger than in our artisan sourdough openings that are nice pockets for basically catching all of the toppings. I really love the idea of a saucy, full sandwich with these. So let's see where we landed. Yeah, so it's still not quite that same opening. I'd like to see these type of pockets that you're seeing in places more throughout, whereas I'm seeing a crumb structure that is a little bit more constricted. So it's still not my perfect ciabatta, but the taste is there, the sizing's there, the crust is there, and so we still have a ways to go to get it where we need to be. I would really love to see what you guys might be able to contribute to the discussion. I am looking to open up everywhere, and I thought that introducing the high gluten flour would be an answer, but the truth is right now in my trials, the white Sonora blend that we use, which is 30% white Sonora and the rest is a bread flour, it on its own outperformed this. So if you go through our social media feed, you'll see a more recent ciabatta result where I did have the crumb structure I was looking for. I was hoping it would strengthen by supplementing slightly with high gluten, but right now I'm observing something different. So I'm gonna keep having to work on this until I feel like it's super consistent and I'm confident about it. And I don't expect that to happen overnight. It was 12 months of iterations with croissants before we started getting the crumb structure we wanted every single time, or most every single time. And it actually was first most every single time. We went from kind of one-off incredible honeycomb to every 2 out of 3 we were getting incredible honeycomb. And we started to narrow it to where now when we don't get that beautiful honeycomb structure in our croissants, we wonder, what? How did that happen? And it's a really rare thing that happens to us now. Ciabatta, I would say, is back there somewhere where croissants were because I gave it up for a couple years. I was working on other things. I feel like my hands are capable of handling this dough. I feel confident in bringing this to the world, but I know that there's more room for improvement, and I know that this bread will get better over time, hopefully with some help.